Then Maria came, and after a cheerful meal I accompanied her to our little room. She was lovelier that evening, warmer and more intimate than she had ever been. The love she gave me was so tender that I felt it as the most complete abandon. "Maria," said I, "you are as prodigal today as a goddess. Don't kill us both quite. Tomorrow, after all, is the ball. Whom have you got for a cavalier tomorrow? I'm very much afraid it is a fairy prince who will carry you off, and I shall never see you any more. Your love tonight is almost like that of good lovers who bid each other farewell for the last time." She put her lips close to my ear and whispered, "Don't say that, Harry. Any time might be the last time. If Hermione takes you, you will come no more to me. Perhaps she will take you tomorrow." Never did I experience the feeling peculiar to those days, that strange, bittersweet alternation of mood, more powerfully than on that night before the ball. It was happiness that I experienced. There was the loveliness of Maria and her surrender. There was the sweet and subtle sensuous joy of inhaling and tasting 100 pleasures of the senses that I had only begun to know as an elderly man. I was bathed in sweet joy like a rippling pool, and yet that was only the shell. Within, all was significant and tender with fate, and while love lost and tender, I was busied with the little sweet appealing things of love, and sank apparently without a care in the caress of happiness. I was conscious all the while in my heart how my fate raced on at breakneck speed, racing and chasing like a frightened horse, straight for the precipitous abyss, spurred on by dread and longing to the consummation of death. Just as a short while before I had fought, in fear and shyness, against the pleasant wantonness of merely sensual love, and felt a dread of Maria's beauty that laughingly offered itself, so now I felt a dread of death, a dread, however, that was already conscious of its approaching change into surrender and release. Even while we were lost in the silent and deep preoccupation of our love, and belonged more closely than ever to one another, my soul bid adieu to Maria, and leave of all that she had meant to me. I had learned from her, once more before the end, to confine myself like a child to life's surface play, to pursue a fleeting joy, and to be both child and beast in the innocence of sex, a state that, in earlier life, I had only known rarely and as an exception. The life of the senses and of sex had nearly always had for me the bitter accompaniment of guilt, the sweet but dread taste of forbidden fruit that puts a spiritual man on his guard. Now, Hermione and Maria had shown me this garden in its innocence, and I had been a guest there, and thankfully. But it would soon be time to go on further. It was too agreeable and too warm in this garden. It was my destiny to make another bid for the crown of life in the expiation of its endless guilt. An easy life, an easy love, an easy death. These were not for me. From what the girls told me, I gathered that for the ball next day, or in connection with it, quite unusual delights and extravagances were on foot. Perhaps it was a climax, and perhaps Maria's suspicion was correct. Perhaps this was our last night together, and perhaps the morning would bring a new unwinding of fate. I was aflame with longing, and breathless with dread. I clung wildly to Maria, and there flared within me a last burst of desire, which made me run all over a garden, and have been once more into the sweet fruit of the tree in paradise. I made it by day for the sleep I had lost at night. After a bath I went home dead tired. I dug in my bedroom, and as I undressed I came on the verses in my pocket, but I forgot them again, and lay down forthwith. I forgot Maria and Hermione and the mass ball, and slapped the clock round. It was not till I had got up in the evening and was shaving that I remembered that the ball began in an hour, and that I had to find a dress shirt. I got myself ready in very good humour, and went out to have dinner. It was the first mass ball I was to participate in. In earlier days, it is true, I had now and again attended such festivities, and even sometimes found them very entertaining, but I had never danced. I had been a spectator merely. As for the enthusiasm with which others had talked and rejoiced over them in my hearing, it had always struck me as funny. And out of the day had come for me too to find the occasion full of pleasant and painful suspense. As I had no partner to take, I decided not to go till late. This too Hermione had counselled me. Lately, I had seldom been to the Steel Helmet, my former refuge, where the disappointed men sat out their evenings, soaking in their wine and playing at bachelor life. It did not suit the life I had come to lead since. This evening, however, I was drawn to it before I was aware. In the mood between joy and fear that fate and parting impose on me just now, all the stations and shrines of meditation in my life's pilgrimage caught once more that gleam of pain and beauty that comes from things past. And so too had the little tavern, thick with smoke, among whose patrons I had only recently been numbered, and whose primitive opiate of a bottle of land wine had lately heartened me enough to spend one more night in my lonely bed and to endure life for one more day. I had tasted other specifics and stronger stimuli since then, and sipped a sweeter poison. With a smile, I entered the old inn. The landlady greeted me, and so, with a nod, did the silent company of habitués. A roast chicken was commended and soon set before me. The limpid Alsacer sparkled in the thick peasant glass. The clean white wooden tables and the old yellow wainscoting had a friendly look. And while I ate and drank, there came over me that feeling of change and decay and of farewell celebrations, that sweet and inwardly painful feeling of being a living part of all the scenes and all the things of an earlier life that has never yet been parted from, and from which the time to part has come. The modern man calls this sentimentality. He has lost the love of inanimate objects. He does not even love his most sacred object, his motor car, but is ever hoping to exchange it as soon as he can for a later model. This modern man has energy and ability. He is healthy, cool, and strenuous, a splendid type, and in the next war he will be a miracle of efficiency. But all that was no concern of mine. I was not a modern man, nor an old-fashioned one either. I had escaped time altogether, and went my way, with death at my elbow, and death as my resolve. I had no objection to sentimentalities. I was glad and thankful to find a trace of anything like a feeling still remaining in my burnt-out heart. So I let my memories of the old tavern and my attachment to the solid wooden chairs and the smell of smoke and wine, and the air of use and want and warmth and homeliness that the place had, carry me away. There is beauty in farewells, and a gentleness in their very tone. The hard seat was dear to me, and so was the peasant glass and the cool racy taste of the Alsacer, and my intimacy with all and everything in this room, and the faces of the bent and dreaming drinkers, those disillusioned ones whose brother I'd been for so long. All this was bourgeois sentimentality, lightly seasoned with a touch of the old-fashioned romance of inns, a romance coming from my boyhood, when inns and wine and cigars were still forbidden things, strange and wonderful. But no Steppenwolf rose before me baring his teeth to tear my sentiment to pieces. I sat there in peace in the glow of the past, whose setting still shed a faint afterglow. A street seller came in, and I bought a handful of roasted chestnuts. An old dame came in with flowers, and I bought a bunch of violets and presented them to the landlady. It was not till I was about to pay my bill and felt in vain for the pocket of the coat I usually wore, that I realized once more that I was in evening dress. The masked ball, and Hermione. It was still early enough, however. I could not convince myself to go to the Globe Room straight away. I felt, too, as I had in the case of all the pleasures that had lately come my way, a whole array of checks and resistances. I had no inclination to enter the large and crowded and noisy rooms. I had a schoolboy's shyness of the strange atmosphere and the world of pleasure and dancing. As I sauntered along, I passed by a cinema with its dazzling lights and huge coloured posters. I went on a few steps, then turned again, and went in. There till 11 I could sit quietly and comfortably in the dark. Following the attendant with the pocket light, I stumbled through the curtains into the darkened hall, found a seat, and was suddenly in the middle of the Old Testament. The film was one of those that are normally not shown for money. Much expense and many refinements are lavished upon them in a more sacred and noble cause, and at midday even school children are brought to see them by their religious teachers. This one was the story of Moses and the Israelites in Egypt, with a huge crowd of men, horses, camels, palaces, splendours of the pharaohs, and tribulations of the Jews in the desert. I saw Moses, whose hair recalled portraits of Walt Whitman, a splendidly theatrical Moses, wandering through the desert at the head of the Jews, with a dark and fiery eye and a long staff and the stride of a Wotan. I saw him pray to God at the edge of the Red Sea, and I saw the Red Sea parted to give free passage, a deep road between piled-up mountains of water. The confirmation classes conducted by the clergy to see this religious film could argue without end as to how the film people manage this. I saw the prophet and his awestruck people pass through to the other side, and behind them I saw the war chariots of Pharaoh come into sight, and the Egyptians stop and start on the brink of the sea. And then, when they ventured courageously on, I saw the mountainous waters close over the head of Pharaoh in all the splendour of his gold trappings, and over all his chariots and all his men, recalling, as I saw it, Handel's wonderful duet for two basses, in which this event is magnificently sung. I then saw Moses climbing Sinai, a gloomy hero in a gloomy wilderness of rocks, and I looked on as Jehovah in the midst of storm and thunder and lightning imparted the 10 Commandments to him, while his worthless people set up the golden calf at the foot of the mountain and gave themselves over to somewhat roisterous celebrations. I found it so strange and incredible to be looking on at all this, to be seeing this sacred writ, with its heroes and its wonders, the source in our childhood of the first dawning suspicion of another world than this, presented for money before a grateful public that sat quietly eating the provisions brought with it from home. A nice little picture indeed, picked up by chance in the huge wholesale clearance of culture in these days. My God, rather than come to such a pass, it would have been better for the Jews and everyone else, let alone the Egyptians, to have perished in those days and forthwith of a violent and becoming death instead of this dismal pretense of dying by inches that we go in for today. Yes, indeed. My secret repressions and unconfessed fright in face of the masked ball were by no means lessened by the feelings provoked in me by the cinema. On the contrary, they had grown to uncomfortable proportions, and I had to shake myself and think of Hermione before I could go to the globe rooms and dare to enter. It was late, and the ball had been for a long time in full swing. At once, before I had even taken off my things, I was caught up, shy and sober as I was, in the swirl of the massed throng. I was accosted familiarly. Girls summoned me to the champagne rooms, clowns slapped me on the back, and I was addressed on all sides as an old friend. I responded to none of it, but fought my way through the crowded rooms to the cloakroom, and when I got my cloakroom ticket, I put it in my pocket with great care, reflecting that I might need it before very long, when I had had enough of the uproar. Every part of the great building was given over to the festivities. There was dancing in every room and in the basement as well. Corridors and stairs were filled to overflowing with masks and dancing and music and laughter and tumult. Oppressed in heart, I stole through the throng, from the Negro orchestra to the peasant band, from the large and brilliantly lighted principal room, into the passages and onto the stairs, to bars, buffets, and champagne parlours. The walls were mostly hung with wild and cheerful paintings by the latest artists. All the world was there, artists, journalists, professors, businessmen, and of course every adherent of pleasure in the town. In one of the orchestra sat Pablo, blowing with enthusiasm in his curved mouthpiece. As soon as he saw me, he sang out a greeting. Pushed hither and thither in the crowd, I found myself in one room after another, upstairs here and downstairs there. A corridor in the basement had been staged as hell by the artists, and there a band of devils played furiously. After a while I began to look for Hermione, or Maria, and strove time after time to reach the principal room, but either I missed my way or had to meet the current. By midnight I had found no one, and though I had not danced, I was hot and giddy. I threw myself into the nearest chair among utter strangers, and ordered some wine, and came to the conclusion that joining in such rowdy festivals was no part for an old man like me. I drank my glass of wine while I stared at the naked arms and backs of the women, watched the crowd of grotesquely masked figures drifting by, and silently declined the advances of a few girls who wished to sit on my knee or get me to dance. Old Growler, one called after me, and she was right. I decided to raise my spirits with the wine, but even the wine went against me, and I could scarcely swallow a second glass. And then the feeling crept over me that the Steppenwolf was standing behind me with his tongue out. Nothing pleased me. I was in the wrong place. To be sure, I had come with the best intentions, but this was no place for me to be merry in. And all this loud effervescence of pleasure, the laughter and the whole foolery of it on every side, seemed to me forced and stupid. Thus it was that, at about 1 o'clock, in anger and disillusionment, I steered a course for the cloakroom, to put on my coat again and go. It was surrender and backsliding into my wolfishness, and Hermione would scarcely forgive me. But I could not do otherwise. All the way as I squeezed through the throng to the cloakroom, I still kept a careful lookout in case I might yet see one of my friends, but in vain. Now I stood at the counter. Already the attendant was politely extending his hand for my number. I felt in my waistcoat pocket. The number was no longer there. The devil, that is all I needed. Often enough during my forlorn wanderings through the rooms, and while I sat over my tasteless wine, I'd felt in my pocket, fighting back the resolve to go away again, and I had always found the round flat check in its place. And now it was gone. Everything was against me. "Lost your number?" came in a shrill voice from a small red and yellow devil at my elbow. "Here, comrade, you can take mine." And he held it out to me without more ado. While I mechanically took it and turned it over in my fingers, the brisk little fellow rapidly disappeared. When, however, I examined the pasteboard counter for a number, no number was to be seen. Instead, there was a scribble in a tiny hand. I asked the attendant to wait and went to the nearest light to read it. There, in little crazy letters that were scarcely legible, was scrawled, "Tonight, at the Magic Theatre, for madmen only. Price of admittance, your mind. Not for everybody. Hermione is in hell." As a marionette, whose threat the operators let go for a moment, wakes to new life after a brief paralysis of death and coma, and once more plays its lively part, so did I, at this jerk of the magic threat, throw myself with the elasticity and eagerness of youth into the tumult from which I had just retreated in the listlessness and weariness of elderly years. Never did sinner show more haste to get to hell. A moment before my patent leather shoes had galled me, the heavily scented air disgusted me, and the heat undone me. Now on my winged feet I nimbly one step through every room on the way to hell. The very air had a charm. The warmth embedded me and wafted me on. And so no less did the rider's music, the intoxication of colours, the perfume of women's shoulders, the clamour of the 100 tongues, the laughter, the rhythm of the dance, and the glances of all the kindled eyes. A Spanish dancing girl flung herself into my arms. "Dance with me." "Can't," said I. "I'm bound for hell, but I'll gladly take a kiss with me." The red mouth beneath the mask met mine, and with a kiss I recognized Maria. I caught her tight in my arms, and like a June rose bloomed her full lips. By this time we were dancing, our lips still joined. Past Pablo we danced, who hung like a lover over his softly wailing instrument. Those lovely animal eyes embraced us with their half-abstracted radiance. But before we had gone 20 steps, the music broke off, and regretfully, I let go of Maria. "I'd have loved to have danced with you again," I said, intoxicated with the warmth. "Come with me a step or two, Maria. I'm in love with your beautiful arm. Let me have it a moment longer. But you see, Hermione has summoned me. She's in hell." I thought so. "Farewell, Harry. I won't forget you." She left me. Left me indeed. Yes, it was autumn. It was fate that had given the summer rose so full and ripe a scent. On I went, through the long corridors, full of tender embraces, and down the stairs to hell. There on pitch-black walls shone wicked garish lights, and the orchestra of devils was playing feverishly. On a high stool at the bar there was seated a pretty young fella, without a mask, and an evening dress, who scrutinized me with a cursory and mocking glance. Pressed to the wall by the swirl of dancers, about 20 couples were dancing in this very confined space. I examined all the women with eager suspense. Most were still in masks and smiled at me, but none was Hermione. The handsome youth on the high stool glanced mockingly at me. At the next pause, thought I, she will come and summon me. The dance ended, but no one came. I went over to the bar, which was squeezed into a corner of the small and low room, and taking a seat near the young man, I ordered a whiskey. While I drank it, I saw his profile. It had a familiar charm, like a picture from long ago, precious for the very dust that had settled on it from the past. Oh, then it flashed through me. It was Hermann, the friend of my youth. "Hermann," I stammered. She smiled. "Harry, have you found me?" It was Hermione, barely disguised by the makeup of her hair and a little paint. The stylish collar gave an unfamiliar look to the pallor of her intelligent face. The wide black sleeves of her dress coat and the white cuffs made her hands look curiously small, and the long black trousers gave a curious elegance to her feet in their black and white silk socks. "Is this the costume, Hermione, in which you mean to make me fall in love with you?" "So far," she said, "I've contented myself with turning the heads of the ladies, but now your turn has come. First, let's have a glass of champagne." So we did, perched on our stools while the dance went on around us to the lively and fevered strain of the strings. And without Hermione appearing to give herself the least trouble, I was very soon in love with her. As she was dressed as a boy, I could not dance with her, nor allow myself any tender advances. And while she seemed distant and neutral in her male mask, her looks and words and gestures encircled me with all her feminine charm. Without so much as having touched her, I surrendered to her spell, and this spell itself kept within the part she played. It was the spell of a hermaphrodite, for she talked to me about Hermann and about childhood, mine and her own, and about those years of childhood when the capacity for love, in its first youth, embraces not only both sexes, but all and everything, sensuous and spiritual, and endows all things with the spell of love and a fairy-like ease of transformation, such as in later years comes again only to a chosen few, and to poets, and to them, rarely. Throughout she kept up the part of a young man, smoking cigarettes and talking with a spirited ease that often had a little mockery in it. And yet it was all iridescent with the rays of desire, and transformed, as it reached my senses, into a charming seduction. How well and thoroughly I thought I knew Hermione, and yet what a completely new revelation of herself she opened up to me that night. How gently and inconspicuously she cast the net I longed for around me, and how playfully and how like a pixie she gave me the sweet poison to drink. We sat and talked and drank champagne. We strolled through the rooms and looked about us. We went on voyages of exploration to discover couples whose love-making it amused us to spy upon. She pointed out women whom she recommended me to dance with, and gave me advice as to the methods of attack to be employed with each. We took the floor as rivals and paid court for a while to the same girl, danced with her by turns, and both tried to win her heart. And yet it was all only a carnival, only a game between the two of us that caught us more closely together in our own passion. It was all a fairy tale. Everything had a new dimension, a deeper meaning. Everything was fanciful and symbolic. There was one girl of great beauty but looking tragic and unhappy. Hermann danced with her and made her blossom. They disappeared to drink champagne together, and she told me afterwards that she'd made a conquest of her, not as a man, but as a woman, with the spell of Lesbos. For my part, the whole building, reverberating everywhere with the sound of dancing, and the whole intoxicated crowd of masks, became by degrees a wild dream of paradise. Flower upon flower wooed me with its scent. I toyed with fruit after fruit. Serpents looked at me from green and leafy shadows with mesmeric eyes. Lotus blossoms luxuriated over black bogs. Enchanted birds sang allurement from the trees. Yet all was a progress to one longed-for goal, the summons of a new yearning for one, and one only. Once I was dancing with a girl I did not know. I had swept her with the ardour of a lover into the giddy swirl of dancers, and while we hung in this unreal world, she suddenly remarked with a laugh, "One wouldn't know you. You were so dull and boring before." Then I recognized the girl who had called me Old Growler a few hours before. She thought she got me now, but with the next dance it was another for whom my ardour glowed. I danced without ceasing for 2 hours or more, every dance and some, even, that I had never danced before. Every now and then Hermann was near me, and gave me a nod and a smile as she disappeared in the throng. An experience fell to my lot this night of the ball that I had never known in all my 50 years, though it is known to every flapper and student. The intoxication of a general festivity, the mysterious merging of the personality in the mass, the mystic union of joy. I had often heard it spoken of. It was known, I knew, to every servant girl. I had often observed the sparkle in the eye of those who told me of it, and I had always treated it with a half-superior, half-envious smile. 100 times in my life I'd seen examples of those whom rapture had intoxicated and released from the self, of that smile, that half-crazed absorption, of those whose heads have been turned by a common enthusiasm. I'd seen it in drunken recruits and sailors, and also in great artists in the enthusiasm, perhaps, of a musical festival, and not less in young soldiers going to war. Even in recent days I'd marvelled at, and loved, and mocked, and envied this gleam, and smile in my friend, Pablo, when he hung over his saxophone in the blissful intoxication of playing in the orchestra, or when, enraptured and ecstatic, he looked over to the conductor, the drum, or the man with the banjo. It had sometimes occurred to me that such a smile, such a childlike radiance could be possible only to quite young persons, or among those peoples whose customs permitted no marked differences between one individual and another. But today, on this blessed night, I myself, the Steppenwolf, was radiant with this smile. I myself swam in this deep and childlike happiness of a fairy tale. I myself breathed the sweet intoxication of a common dream, and of music and rhythm and wine and carnal lust. I, who had in other days so often listened with amusement or dismal superiority to its panegyric in the ballroom chatter of some student. I was myself no longer. My personality was dissolved in the intoxication of the festivity like salt in water. I danced with this woman or that, but it was not only the one I had in my arms, and whose hair brushed my face, that belonged to me. All the other women who were dancing in the same room and the same dance and to the same music, and whose radiant faces floated past me like fantastic flowers, belonged to me, and I to them. All of us had a part in one another, and the men too. I was with them also. They too were no strangers to me. Their smile was mine, and mine their wooing, and theirs mine. A new dance, a foxtrot with the title Yearning, had swept the world that winter. Once we'd heard it, we could not have enough of it. We were all soaked in it and intoxicated with it, and everyone hummed the melody whenever it was played. I danced without stop, and with anyone who came in my way, with quite young girls, with women in their earlier or their later prime, and with those who had sadly passed them both. And with them all I was enraptured, laughing, happy, radiant. And when Pablo saw me so radiant, me whom he had always looked on as a very lamentable poor devil, his eyes beamed blissfully upon me, and he was so inspired that he got up from his chair, and blowing lustily in his horn, climbed up on it. From this elevation he blew with all his might, while at the same time his whole body and his instrument with it swayed to the tune of Yearning. I and my partner kissed our hands to him and sang loudly in response. Ah, thought I, meanwhile, let come to me what may, for once at least, I too have been happy, radiant, released from myself, a brother of Pablo's, a child. I had lost the sense of time, and I don't know how many hours or moments the intoxication of happiness lasted. I did not observe either that the brighter the festal fire burned, the narrower were the limits within which it was confined. Most people had already left. The corridors were silent and many of the lights out. The stairs were deserted, and in the rooms above one orchestra after another had stopped playing and gone away. It was only in the principal room and in hell below that the orgy still raged in a crescendo. Since I could not dance with Hermione as a boy, we had only had fleeting encounters in the pauses between the dances, and at last I lost sight of her entirely. And not only sight, but thought. There were no thoughts left. I was lost in the maze and whirl of the dance. Scents and tones and sighs and words stirred me. I was greeted and kindled by strange eyes, encircled by strange faces, borne hither and thither in time to the music, as though by a wave. And then of a sudden I saw, half coming to my senses for a moment, among the last who still kept it up in one of the smaller rooms, and filled it to overflowing, the only one in which the music still sounded. Of a sudden I saw a black Pierrette, with face painted white. She was fresh and charming, the only masked figure left, and a bewitching apparition that I had never in the whole course of the night seen before. While in everyone else the late hour showed itself in flushed and heated faces, crushed dresses, limp collars, and crumpled ruffs, the black Pierrette stood there fresh and neat, with her white face beneath her mask. Her costume had not a crease, and not a hair was out of place. Her ruff and pointed cuffs were untouched. I rushed towards her, put my arms around her, and drew her into the dance. Her perfumed ruff tickled my chin. Her hair brushed my cheek. The young vigour of her body answered my movements as no one else's had done that night, yielding to them with an inward tenderness and compelling them to new contact by the play of her allurements. I bent down to kiss her mouth as we danced. Its smile was triumphant and long familiar. Of a sudden I recognized the firm chin, the shoulders, arms and hands. It was Hermione. Hermann no longer. Hermione in a change of dress, fresh, perfumed, powdered. Our lips met passionately. For a moment her whole body to her knees clung in longing and surrender to mine. Then she drew her mouth away and, holding back, fled from me as we danced. When the music broke off, we were still clasped where we stood. All the excited couples round us clapped, stamped, cried out and urged the exhausted orchestra to play Yearning over again. And now a feeling that it was morning fell upon us all. We saw the ashen light behind the curtains. It warned us of pleasure's approaching end, and gave us symptoms of the weariness to come. Blindly, with bursts of laughter, we flung ourselves desperately into the dance once more, into the music, and the light began to flood the room. Our feet moved in time to the music as though we were possessed, every couple touching, and once more we felt the great wave of bliss break over us. Hermione abandoned her triumphant air, her mockery and coolness. She knew that there was no more to do to make me love her. I was hers, and her way of dancing, her looks and smiles and kisses, all showed that she gave herself to me. All the women of this fevered night, all that I had danced with, all whom I had kindled or who had kindled me, all whom I had courted, all who had clung to me with longing, all whom I had followed with enraptured eyes, were melted together and had become one, the one whom I held in my arms. On and on went this nuptial dance. Time after time the music flagged. The wind let their instruments fall. The pianist got up from the piano. The first fiddle shook his head. And every time they were won over by the imploring persistence of the last intoxicated dancers, and played once more. They played faster and more wildly. Then at last, as we stood, still entwined and breathless after the last eager dance, the piano was closed with a bang, and our arms fell wearily to our sides, like those of the wind and strings, and the flutist, blinking sleepily, put his flute away in its case. Doors opened, the cold air poured in, attendants appeared with cloaks, and the bar waiter turned off the light. The whole scene vanished eerily away, and the dancers who a moment ago had been all on fire shivered as they put on coats and cloaks and turned up their collars. Hermione was pale but smiling. Slowly she raised her arm and pushed back her hair. As she did so, one arm caught the light, and a faint and indescribably tender shadow ran from her armpit to her hidden breast, and this little trembling line of shadow seemed to me to sum up all the charm and fascination of her body, like a smile. We stood looking at one another, the last in the whole building. Somewhere below I heard a door bang, a glass break, a titter of laughter die away, mixed with the angry hurried noise of motor cars starting up. And somewhere at an indeterminable distance in height, I heard a laugh ring out, an extraordinarily clear and merry peal of laughter. Yet it was eerie and strange. It was a laugh made of crystal and ice, bright and radiant, but cold and inexorable. Where had I heard this laugh before? I could not tell. We stood and looked at one another. For a moment I came to my sober self. I felt a fearful weariness descend upon me. I felt with repugnance how moist and limp my clothing hung around me. I saw my hands emerging red and with swollen veins from my crumpled and wilted cuffs. But all at once the mood passed, banished by a look from Hermione. At this look, that seemed to come from my own soul, all reality fell away, even the reality of my sensuous love of her. Bewitched, we looked at one another. My poor little soul looked at me. "You ready?" asked Hermione, and her smile fled away like the shadows on her breast. Far up in unknown space rang out that strange and eerie laughter. I nodded. Oh yes, I was ready.